in the series this week is in the series on institutions and state politics. The last time you heard from me, it was about state legislatures, the legislative branch. This is about governors, the executive branch, and then the next one will be about courts, which is the judicial branch. When we talk about institutions, again, we're talking about the three branches of government and the people who work therein. We usually think of governors as central figures in American state politics. They are deemed the leader of the state, the leader of the executive branch. Usually, citizens have high expectations about what the governor is supposed to do. Usually, people think about the governor as a person who leads the state in the same way the president of the United States leads the nation. It's generally a very competitive race to become a governor of a state, and generally very expensive, as we discussed, in much the same way that it's expensive to run for the state legislature. It's extremely to run for the governor's office because a person has to run across the whole state. Governors have both formal powers and informal powers. The formal powers are powers that are found in the Constitution or in the state statutes of the state. They're going to vary by the state, so governors will have varying ranges of power in their state depending on what's in the Constitution of the state. And then there are some informal powers that governors have, and those will be based on the personality type of the individual who holds the position and their ability to talk to others and to get things done on the basis of just who they are. So we'll talk more about the powers of governors later. Like other chief executive officers, the governor has multiple roles to play, and those include chief legislator, administrator, party leader, head of state, negotiator, opinion leader, and crisis manager. So we'll go through and talk about each of these in turn. Behaving as a chief administrator, the governor is responsible for coordinating the state bureaucracy. So when we think about how government works and we think about everything that is created coming from the legislative branch, and then everything is interpreted by the courts, everything else that's not being created or not being interpreted is left to the executive branch, which means that there is a massive organization of folks who are supposed to do the work of making the day-to-day operations of governments go. And we usually think about that or call that the bureaucracy. The governor, as a chief administrator, is responsible to supervise major state programs. So state programs will have or will vary from state to state based on the priorities of the governor and based on the culture of the state. For example, when I lived in the state of Florida, one of the big programs or one of the big goals was to try to get people to read to children, to read in schools, and all of these other kinds of things. So the governor of the state was responsible for managing that program. The governor oversees the preparation of the state budget. So remember that one of the most important functions of the legislature is to pass the budget. But the budget that the legislature passes starts in the governor's office. So when we talk more about taxation and finance, we'll talk about the budget process. But as the chief administrator, it's important that you know the governor oversees the preparation of the state budget. They resolve conflicts that occur within the administration. So the administration, again, is this bureaucracy, the set of folks who work for the governor. They're responsible for the financial structure of the state. And if scandal occurs in the administration within the state, it's the governor's responsibility to try to get it fixed. The governor is also the chief legislator. So at some point in class, I might tell you a story about working with Jeb Bush, who was the governor of Florida, to try to create a scholarship program for students in the state of Florida. So this idea came from conversations I had with other members of student government at FAMU. And in those discussions, we thought it might be a good idea to create a scholarship to increase the number of black kids who were going to college, and by extension, first-generation students of any race. So as the person who was working with us on that, we had Jeb Bush, who was supposed to be the chief legislator, the person who was working with members of the legislature to make that thing go. So the governor is the chief legislator. They are supposed to be initiating legislative programs like the one I just talked about, and like other programs according to their priorities. They, as I mentioned, are supposed to be initiating public policy decisions by sending bills to the legislature. So in the instance I talked about in the state of Florida, what that looks like is an idea coming from a group of people who worked on a committee to say this is what we think should happen in terms of creating this scholarship, and then someone in the governor's office sends a bill over to the legislature to get that done. They are supposed to be maintaining relationships with legislators as well as lobbyists. They are involved in the legislative process through veto power. So remember, when we talked about legislatures, we talked about the idea that legislation has to come through the upper house and the lower house, generally termed the House and the Senate. It's supposed to be matching through those places. Once it leaves those places, it goes to the governor's office for a signature. And in going to the governor's office for the signature, the governor can choose to sign it and approve it, or the governor can choose to veto it. And if the governor vetoes it, then the bill does not become a law unless the legislature decides to do an override, which would take a supermajority of the members of the legislature to get that done. The governor also has the ability to call special sessions of the legislature if they see fit. The governor is the ceremonial head of state. So in this picture here, you see the governor of Florida at this time signing a bill. That bill that the governor is signing, the governor's person who's seated with pens, the bill that the governor is signing is the First Generation Matching Grant, which is the legislation I just talked about that created a scholarship for students in the state of Florida who were the first in their family to go to college. And if you look very closely, you can see a younger Dr. Grant in the background smiling and happy about the fact that we got some money for students. But what's happening here is a bill signing on the campus of Florida A&M University. I don't know if you notice those folks in the back are all wearing orange and green. That's because we're at FAMU. And governors do this sometimes to bring publicity to the bills that they have signed. So as a ceremonial head of state, governors sign bills into law in public in this way. They welcome delegations from various places. They could be from other states. They could be from within the state. They could be from international places. They attend association conventions. They hold conferences. They represent the state in the nation and internationally when they travel. The governor is also a crisis manager. When things happen, be they disasters or other kinds of large-scale crises, people expect that the governor will step in to have something kind of useful to do or say. In the case of disasters, they can declare states of emergency. And if they do decide to declare states of emergency, then it's possible to unlock funding in the state to help deal with those things. Sometimes governors deal with things related to collapsing infrastructure. So when we talk about, or when you hear people talk about infrastructure, they're talking about roads and bridges and all the other things that, buildings, all the other things that we live in or that we use to get from place to place. They can step in times of civil disorder and chaos. If there are mass murders, if there are economic crises, all of these are times we expect the governor to be a crisis manager. And in times when things are far beyond the control of the police, sometimes the governors can call the National Guard units in their state to help crisis situations to kind of stabilize things. Where do governors come from? Like, what is the background of governors? In the last slideshow, we talked about this a little bit, that the background of the people who are elected to office is going to be similar regardless of their position. Let's see if governors fit that mold. They come from a variety of backgrounds, generally speaking wealthy, famous families, upwardly mobile people. Some of them have come from humble beginnings. Some of them have been what they call educated populace. An educated populace is a person who comes from kind of around the way from a humble beginning, but ends up getting like extremely valuable educations, and by way of their education are not kind of like a normal person anymore or average folk anymore, but still come from that kind of background. They come from a variety of areas. Again, there's no rule about what you must do in order to be elected to office. Nobody says that you have to be a lawyer to be elected to office. or that you have to have any kind of job before you get elected to office. I guess I don't have to explain that to you all in the ways that I used to have to explain it after Donald Trump won the presidency. I mean, clearly, you could come from anywhere. But you see that governors have come from a variety of places. They come from acting, they come from wrestling. Somebody's been a country music singer. Most of them have been attorneys. Pretty much all the time, you're going to find that folks who are participating in government have some kind of interest in the law, but that is not a requirement to participate in politics. Many of the people who serve as governors of their state go on to become president of the United States. So this is a graphic so far of all the people who have been president of the United States who first started as governor of a state. Politics are important to governors. Some of the things we consider when we talk about gubernatorial politics are listed here. Usually there's a strong primary and general election for governor. Like in most states, the governorship is not something that you can kind of roll into. It's not uncontested like some of the state legislative positions that we talked about in the last slideshow. Whether or not folks get elected can be based on national trends, what we call coattails. So if it's the case that people are like very thrilled with and in love with the Republican Party, then the next time that there are elections for governors within a state, it could be the case that people vote for Republicans because Republicans are extremely popular. Or if it is the case that folks are very distrustful of Republicans, the next time there is an election, it could be the case that the Republican gubernatorial candidate loses the election because people don't really like the Republican Party as a whole at the time. So national trends can affect the state level trends. Personal leadership qualities matter. So people have the ability to do different things, accomplish different things in politics, and accomplish different things in campaigns sometimes based on the leadership that they exhibit as individuals. I talked a little bit about the coattails like moments ago, but the coattail effect can be strong if the president is popular. So if a Democratic president is popular, is elected to office, people love the Democratic president, it could be the case that more Democrats are elected to office as a function of the president's popularity. Usually the campaign for governor is candidate centered, which, remember, if you go back a couple slideshows, we talked about the responsible party model and we talked about the candidate center model. And we talked about the candidate center model as this situation where the individual who is running for office is responsible for raising their own money and creating their own message. So the campaigns for governor are usually candidate centered. It's based on what the individual wants to do with their policy, how much money they can raise, and that kind of stuff until they get past the primary election to the general election. And even within the general election, an individual's popularity is important. Having being able to identify which issues are most important matters and can mean a great deal to a person's potential victory or to their loss. So if gubernatorial candidates are able to get kind of a strong sense of what folks are interested in or what they care about deeply in the state, and they speak to those issues during those campaigns, then that helps them win elections. If the campaign is built around things that people don't really care about, then it becomes more difficult to get elected to office because people have a sense that you are talking about things that are not really important to them. Incumbents usually win the elections for governors in just the same way that incumbents or people who are currently holding the job win the state legislative positions. Campaigning in states for the position of governor has started to look a lot like campaigning for presidents, and this has to do with this candidate center stuff that I talked about moments ago. But the individual is responsible, or frequently does, go out and raise their own money under their own name and creates their own organization to run for office. both in the primary and then later with the help of the party during the general election. Campaigns for governor usually require millions and millions of dollars, depending on the size of the state, because the governor has to run, as I mentioned, across the whole state and not just within a small area like a member of the state legislature would have to do. And as I mentioned before, governors go on to become presidents frequently. They account for about 1/3 of the U.S. presidents. Earlier, we talked about the power of the governor being both formal and informal, that the power of the governor is formal and informal. So in order to determine the formal power of the government, we first need to think about the governor's role as it is specified by or outlined in the state constitution. The state constitution will tell us what they can do. Some of the institutional powers in the state constitution are the ones listed here. Also important are to consider are the state statutes. So the legislatures can create responsibilities for the governors as laws, and then those things will also become powers of the governor. So they have the ability to appoint people, to remove people. Generally, folks who are appointed by the governor to big or important positions have to be confirmed by the state senate through our system of checks and balances. But they can appoint people, they can remove people. Sometimes they may or may not be able to succeed themselves. Secession is this idea that if you are in the office, you can run for office again. So that's the idea of secession. And if a person can succeed themselves, they'll have more power than if they can't succeed themselves. The relationship that the governor has to the budget is important in determining their power, where if you have kind of complete control over your budget and whatever you write is going to pass because you have a friendly legislature, you might be deemed more powerful than a person whose budget is going to be contested. Whether or not a governor has veto power also speaks to their relative power. So all of them have veto power. Some of them, many of them, have line item veto power where they can go through the budget bit by bit and make decisions about what they will or won't support by the line item. That's not something that happens in all states, but it happens in many states. And then their position in their party and how popular they are in their party and the likelihood that the party responds positively to their request is also an important consideration when we think about the powers of a governor. Some governors have sought to reorganize the state executive branch. So the governor is the leader of the executive branch, but there are other people, generally speaking, in states who have the ability to control different parts of the executive branch because they're also elected to office. So this idea that we should consolidate, or people want to consolidate, these other roles or these other people who are elected to office into one central job is another measure that we think about when we consider the governor's power. Usually, governors have the ability to succeed themselves. When we think again about this idea or this notion of these separately elected people, the more people who are elected to statewide positions in a place, the less power a governor has. So some governors seek to consolidate power to make less people elected to statewide office than more people as a way to increase their own power. Something else governors do to increase their power is to eliminate boards and commissions and to create situations where folks are replaceable or able to be removed by the governor without having to answer to different parts of the government. While governors seek to reorganize government to decrease the number of separately elected officials, sometimes they also seek to decrease the number of state agencies and decrease the number of leaders of these various state agencies to make some things come directly under the purview of the office of the governor, so that it's not a separate office, but that's another way that governors can increase their power. People in states and states in general are not really accepting of this idea of decreasing the power of other people so that they can increase the power of the governor. It's been difficult for folks to get their states reorganized so that other separately elected statewide officials lose their jobs, and those jobs go to the governor. Those things are not really popular in the states. So this is a chart of the institutional power of governors, ranked from the most powerful governor to the least. So take a moment there to find your state, the state where you're from. And you'll see that some of the states are tied for most powerful and on down to least powerful. When I was talking about the other people who are elected to office, you look here on the left-hand side of this graphic, you see the people that I'm talking about. So in some places, the governor and the lieutenant governor run together, but in other places, the lieutenant governor runs separately. So that will be a separately elected official. The lieutenant governor doesn't tend to have a bunch of power, but that's a separately elected person. And then you see all these other people who could be separately elected depending on the state. And if it is the case, for example, that the education secretary is separately elected, then the governor of a state no longer has jurisdiction or power over election. That jurisdiction or power rests with the person who is elected to do that job. So that's the way that the governor loses some of the power, that we determine how much power a governor has. The amount of power they have is in part based on how much they share or don't share with other separately elected people. Who is this guy? This man here on your right hand side? That is Deval Patrick. So Deval Patrick is the person who's in your readings. He was the governor of Massachusetts. There have been a very small number of black governors over the course of American history. He is one of them. So that's Deval Patrick. As I mentioned, unrelated to Deval Patrick, there has been opposition in states to this idea that states should be reorganized, and to this idea that governors should have kind of like the most power in the state, or should take some of their power in the state from other separately elected people. The idea of tenure power is the length of time an elected official can serve. This will vary from state to state, and you should look to your state constitution to find out how long your governor can serve. So if you are from, for example, Virginia, your governor serves for 6 years, but your governor does not have the ability to succeed herself or himself. The governor can only serve one term. They have to go do something else, and then if they want to come back in the future, they can. So this idea about tenure power is the length of time that they can stay. Governors have managerial powers, which they usually downplay, and they have the ability to create executive orders. The executive orders tell the people in the bureaucracy, the people who, again, are doing the day-to-day work of government, exactly what they can do, or directs them to do something that they might not otherwise be doing. The man in this picture is Douglas Wilder. Douglas Wilder was the first black governor of Virginia, and he, interestingly, is a graduate of Howard University Law School. So, shout out to the Bison, breaking barriers. The appointment power of the governor is probably the most important managerial power that the governor has. So the governor has like all these jobs at her disposal or his disposal, and the appointment, we call those things appointment powers, their ability to give folks jobs. The state cabinet will vary from state to state, but generally includes the heads of the major executive departments. It generally includes the heads of the major executive departments. But presidents can decide for themselves how they want to organize their state cabinets. In terms of removal powers, the governor does have the ability to remove people from their positions, but the most often they have to be removing them for cause only. For cause only. What does this mean? This means that if you do something that is politically incorrect that the governor doesn't like, the governor should not be able to remove you from your position because you took some political position that they disagree with. The governor should only be removing you from your position if you did something wrong at work. So if you did something for cause, we say. And the governor, as I mentioned before, has fiscal powers. The governor of the state may prepare the state budget. So they might have to think about all the things that happen in the state and write those things out and work with accountants and budget experts to figure out how to organize their states. Again, in terms of the governor's legislative priorities, the governor, the gubernatorial candidate, when they're running, will say this is what they want to do. They'll have these lists of things that they want to do. And the legislature depends on those things to set a priority or to kind of set a standard or a tone for the legislature. Governors like to see a high percentage of the stuff that they recommend get enacted. So they set these priorities, they give these suggestions to the legislature, and they work very hard to make sure that the legislature does what they set out to do, what the governor set out to do. They provide leadership in these things by rallying public support. So when I was working with the governor of the state of Florida, we saw a number of newspaper articles come out, especially like in my hometown paper and other places, that were trying to get support, get people to understand what we were trying to do and get support for those things. It's also the case that they can use their voice when they are making public statements to try to gain support for their priorities. The governors have the ability, as I mentioned, to call special sessions. So a special session says, okay, legislature, I know that you only generally work from January to March, but I need you to come here in May to deal with this special issue. So they can threaten the use of a special session. Like they can say, if you don't get this done, I'll call you back in a special session. And generally, legislators don't like to be in session. If they don't have to be in session, they would prefer to be at home. They might say hearing the concerns of people where they are instead of being in session. But the governor can threaten session as a way to get people to do what they want. Governors can veto, as we mentioned. That's a major source of power for them. It's another way that they can threaten legislatures to get what they want, because the likelihood that a legislature overcomes a veto, that they can get a super majority of support for a bill that the governor vetoes, is low. So they can use vetoes as a way to kind of encourage people to do certain things that they might not otherwise do. The line item veto, as I described previously, is the rejection of a particular item in a bill. So let's say in my example, we're doing the first generation matching grant. If it is the case that the governor, the state of Florida, doesn't have a line item veto, but let's assume that the governor of the state likes everything about the bill except the fact that you have to be first generation. And he wants to change it so that you can be first or second generation. The governor can simply strike that part through to eliminate that first generation piece, and then the bill will go on as it normally would, as if it was any other piece of legislation. So, because governors are elected to office, they are not able to be removed if they're unpopular, for example, unless they are impeached. Impeachment is a political process, not a legal process, at the state level and at the national level. It's a political process, not a legal process. What does that mean? It means that impeachment has to come from the legislature, has to come from the lower house. the trial for a person who has been impeached happens in the upper house, and then 2/3 of the people in the legislature in the legislature, the upper house, have to vote to convict a person who is or has been impeached. And if you are impeached, you are convicted of some kind of charge. Maybe like it's malfeasance, you did your job badly, or nonfeasance, you didn't do your job at all. But they come up with these charges, usually again initiated in the lower house, tried in the upper house, and the 2/3 of the legislature decides to convict the person, and the person is removed from office. Sometimes the impeachments can happen as a function of corruption scandals. So a corruption scandal would be like what Bill Clinton faced in the 1990s after he was accused of having an inappropriate sexual relationship with Monica Lewinsky. Or in the States, sometimes governors end up in these inappropriate situations where they've taken money from people they weren't supposed to take money from, or ended up sleeping with staffers and doing these other kinds of things they weren't supposed to do. When those things happen, members of the legislature can decide to impeach them or remove them from office. A recall is when members of the citizenry or citizens decide to remove a person from office through what's called a recall election. So in a recall election, you start by getting the question on the ballot about whether or not the person should be able to keep their job. And if you get a certain percentage of votes from across the state, and the people across the state decide that they don't want to have this person keep their job, they can put a question on the ballot about whether the person should keep their job. And the question will say, should such and such person be retained in office, yes or no? If a majority of people say yes, such whoever this person is should be retained in office, then the person keeps their job. If a majority of the people say no, this person should not be retained in office, then that person has to leave their position. 19 states have recall elections. Most famous recall election is probably the one of Gray Davis in California in 2003. This is a picture of Anthony Brown. Anthony Brown was the lieutenant governor of the state of Maryland, who got elected to Congress sometime after he was serving as the lieutenant governor. He ran for governor of Maryland and was not elected. Later ran for Congress and got elected to Congress. But this is some information about the other people who are in executive offices outside of the governor. So the lieutenant governor is kind of like a vice president is to the governor, what the vice president is to the president. The attorney general is the chief legal advisor, chief law enforcement official in the state. So they have a bunch of power. Then there are folks who are in charge of money. The treasurer, the auditor, the comptrollers help deal with state's money. The secretary of state is responsible for the records in the state, generally responsible for voting in the state. And then the governor has personal staff, people who work directly in the governor's office to help the governor get things done. That's the end of the chapter on governors and state politics. As I mentioned, the next chapter is on crime, courts, and correctional policies in state and local government.